Hello and welcome to this presentation about conflict. I know that's a word that can be frightening, terrifying, paralyzing, and all the same necessary, depending on your situation in your workplace. I really struggled for how to name this particular presentation because, well, can you really manage conflict? And is there really such a thing as productive conflict? And do people agree that conflict is actually necessary in some ways? I didn't know what the starting point was, so I just figured I'd do this catch-all, and I'm glad to see that so many of you came in to join me for this topic. It is a hot one. For those who are new to Bright Talk, I want to point out a couple of features. First of all, please notice the orange button that says Get Live Support Now. If anything happens, if your sound goes out or if the slides don't seem to be advancing, go ahead and push that button because the folks at Bright Talk are awesome and they will respond to you right away, and they're so much better equipped than I am to handle any issues that you might have. And if you have issues, there's a little good news here. For those attending live, you can always come back to the on-demand presentation later, and if you're attending on demand, well, you can refresh your screen or start over. So somehow, some way, you'll be able to get this. I want you to also notice the portion called attachments and links. I like to load up some bonus content there, and it's all free. It's all for you to take and do what you want with it. One of the things I want to point out here at the beginning, the first attachment is a PDF of the slides that I'm going to be covering. It's a handout, so if you want to print that out for note-taking, it's there, ready to roll. I also want to point out that there's a place where you can ask questions and another place where you can give me some feedback, and I greatly appreciate both from those of you who are listening live. I'd love to take your questions. I'll answer just as many as I can, and I also really, really appreciate your feedback at the end. When it comes to conflict, one of the best ways to reduce unproductive conflict is to be very clear in your communication and to become very effective in both parts of communicating, sending the message as well as receiving the message. And if you want to step back to those fundamentals, please know that I gave you a link in the attachments to that as well. I am doing these webinars on a monthly basis. These are webinars and presentations about interpersonal skills that are necessary for you to do your job. If you're in a management role, you know, you have two jobs. Most of us do a better job with the first half, that's managing the work, than we do with the second part, which is leading people. And so I'm Deb Calvert. I talk about how to both manage work and lead people so that you and your entire team can be more effective. My company is called People First Productivity Solutions, and that's because the work we do is to build organizational strength by putting people first. And every one of these webinars is intended to help you do that. I do run these here on Bright Talk on this channel on a monthly basis. You're welcome to come back and take any content on demand that you'd like to have, and also to sign up for the webinars that are coming up next month. It's a pretty good topic. It's about developing your own personal leadership philosophy. And that is a profound process that most people who actually do it feel differently about themselves and about their work, and have a whole lot of benefits that come out of that process. So I'm going to take you through it step by step. I'll explain what it is, why it matters, and how to do it if you're interested. But today we are going to talk about conflict. And I'll start here just with a general overview, a definition of what conflict is. And as you're reading those definitions, I do have to pose the question, put it out there for us. What if I told you that not all conflict is bad, and that conflict actually does have a purpose? It does in business. And so I'm going to start there. You know, there are some people, in fact, who like conflict, and there are people on the opposite end of the spectrum who absolutely despise any type of conflict. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. We might lean one way or the other. And it's those extremes that we tend to react to. We modify our behavior to cater to the person who is so conflict averse, and we don't want to hurt their feelings or cause them to feel badly in the workplace. And then there are these others who seem to really like conflict, and we also cater to them because we avoid conflict knowing that somehow they might take advantage of it or take advantage of us, or be looking to come on so strong that it becomes unproductive. But there really are two ways for all of us of looking at conflict. We could continue to look at it with all those assumptions and all those bad feelings. We can look at it as something that is always going to lead to problems, to escalated, unfinished business, and really focus on the risk and the discomfort that comes with it. Or we could try to get a paradigm shift and look at conflict and the times when we disagree with others as a way to broaden our own understanding, to get outside our own echo chamber, to come to understanding with somebody else that is beyond what we understand here and now for ourselves today. We might actually enhance our communication if we were a bit more open to that diversity of thought and opinion. And if we thought of conflict as having the express purpose of uncovering issues and problems and concerns, if we thought of it that way, maybe we'd enter into it differently. Maybe we could be more productive with it. Maybe we could proactively keep it from getting to that place where it's really uncomfortable for everybody and it goes nowhere. Because I'm not suggesting any of that stuff is beneficial. So that's what we're aiming for here as we talk about conflict. I think it's also important, by way of setup, for us to talk about where conflict comes from. It comes from a lot of places. Sometimes it really is a clash of personalities or competing interests. We just don't see things the same way because our needs, our values, our roles, the outcomes we're driving for, our goals, they're different. And because they're different, we don't see things the same way. That's all true. And what we need to do to move past or through all of those kinds of differences that might be at the root of our conflict, what we have to do is find common ground. I work with a lot of teams. I do team effectiveness consulting and conduct team effectiveness workshops. And almost without exception, when there are fractures within teams, it's because people have lost sight of their common objectives. They are entrenched in trying to protect their own turf or meet their own needs, and they forget that ultimately yours plus mine equals ours, and we are both responsible for some shared outcomes. And truly effective teams disagree in ways that cause them to do better, not in ways that divide them so no one can really get their job done. But we can't deny that these causes of conflict are real and that we can't just put on a Pollyanna smile and say, well, we all have common objectives, so none of this matters. These things do matter. We need to learn ways to interact with people who have different values, different roles, who we don't see eye to eye with because we have different styles in terms of our own personality. These things exist, and we still have to figure out ways to get along, to get our shared goals met, despite those differences. So if we're looking at conflict, we also have to talk about how it grows and how it gets to a place at times where it's no longer manageable so that we can intersect with it earlier and try to keep it productive. See, no conflict arises suddenly. Few conflicts end quickly, and most conflicts can't shift from one status to the other on this chart without those intermediate steps happening. So in any workplace, in any situation, we start out with harmony. We enter into most relationships or most groups with an initial harmony. There are no visible conflicts. We don't have competing interests yet. We don't know about each other's values. So we start, because of the nature of teams, we start with a certain solidarity, knowing about that common cause that we all have. And over time, that harmony most often becomes a durable peace. It's a high level of sustained cooperation. And that's even though we now have an awareness of some potentially conflicting interests. But at this stage in the game, every member of the team values relationships more than they are focused on specific self-interests. Over time, some teams enter into a stable peace, but that's actually not entirely productive, because with stable peace, we all just begin to take things for granted. We end up having limited communication and cooperation. We have those things because of the basic order and the mutual respect that we have, but we're holding back. We don't have an awareness of each other's values or goals differences. We aren't asking questions that might spotlight places where people disagree. We're relying to a certain extent on groupthink, the fact that everybody's just going to nod their heads and go along, because we're all following sort of this accepted norm, the rules of our stable peace. But that doesn't last. That's not sustainable. People get frustrated when they don't feel heard, or when people don't seem interested in what they could bring to the table. So stable peace usually becomes, over time, an unstable peace. Still peaceful, but you've probably seen this in groups where there's a little bit of tension. It might be unspoken. There's a certain level of suspicion among team members. Friendships either break down or they become cliquey. Some are in, some are out. Those levels of tension, they rise and fall. They're often driven by deadlines or other deliverables. And there can be, at least to an outsider, there can be a very visible observation that can be made where the weaker party is being suppressed, where their achievement of goals, where their pursuits of their own interests, where their opinions are just not as valued by other members of the team. So they end up being somewhat suppressed. And if this goes on long enough, or if it's oppressive enough, it does become a crisis. There will be a tense confrontation. People might engage in things like, making threats or withholding what's needed, or challenging one another. There could even be actual skirmishes. Usually in the workplace, those are verbal. But the probability of war, when you get all the way up here, the probability of war is high. And war is represented in the workplace. That's all-out sustained fighting. It becomes mine and yours, theirs and ours. We have clash, and we become entrenched in our positions, and we refuse to really try to see eye to eye or to get back on the same page. To de-escalate this conflict, we have to be able to work back down the other side and to be able to get to a place where we can become more harmonious, and yet at the same time, we have to be able to manage conflict productively so that it becomes an asset to our team and not a diminisher of it. So here are some things that cause teams to move through this continuum, some things that tend to escalate the conflict. These might be things that you can get ahead of, or they might be symptoms that you're aware of and you just don't really know what to do about it or what's really going on in the team. But when you see these types of things, be sure to pay attention to them. They're significant. They mean that the team is not functioning at its highest possible capacity and that people aren't engaged, so they aren't applying additional discretionary effort, and that the work itself is going to suffer at some point. Anytime that you see these kinds of symptoms within a team, if you see leaders who are interacting with each other appropriately across named work groups, for example, or if you see people getting really mobilized behind their positions or really entrenched in the ways that they will or won't cooperate, then you are probably, as a manager or as a leader, despite whatever your title might be, or as an HR business partner, if you have an opportunity to intervene, these symptoms should be indicators that at least you need to ask some questions and to see if you can't offer some help and to break through this before it becomes even worse. Now, here are the ways that a typical conflict escalates between individuals. So I've shown you a continuum, and we named the stages of conflict, but let's look at it just a little bit differently here. This is how any conflict typically escalates. First of all, something happens. Someone says something or someone does something, and the receiving party or the observer reacts to it. And the way they react at first is through interpreting what they think they have heard or seen. And of course, because we're human, we add our own meaning, our own feelings come into it, something else that we've known or seen or heard, something that we value, something that we know is wrong about it, causes us to interpret it in a way that then triggers a greater emotion, hurt or confusion or anger, indignation, some kind of feeling that's strong enough that causes us to take action, not just have the thinking reaction or the emotional reaction, but the action where we fear the conflict and either back way away from it, or we enter into the conflict to try to right what was wrong, or we try to go face to face with someone to call them out on the wrong that we feel has been done. And all of those reactions and actions, they're typically based on either a misinterpretation or a situation where somebody didn't have all the information, or where we didn't assume good intent. We didn't give people the benefit of the doubt or any grace. Because as soon as the event happened, if we could get away from interpretation and feeling and action, if we could begin sooner to say, well, hold on a second, I'm not sure I understand, or tell me more about that, we might be able to avert a lot of those other steps. That takes a little training and discipline to get to that point. By the way, I noticed that you're taking advantage of those attachments and links. Let me point out another one. There is an infographic included that covers quite a bit of what we're discussing in this presentation. I think it has a little more in it as well. So it's just a visual presentation, a job aid that you might find useful. Okay, now I want to talk next about how to handle conflict, but I'm going to introduce the two pieces of our own experiences and our own preferences that determine how we usually and naturally are responding when this conflict situation presents itself to us. And the first of those factors is our own assertiveness. Our own assertiveness in the times when we are in a conflict situation. Some people tend to be very, very assertive, meaning that they assert their own needs and their own interests. Others are very little in their assertiveness. They really minimize their own needs and their own interests. And of course, this too is a continuum. But if you can think of yourself, are you on the end of the continuum that says you're highly assertive, jumping in to protect your needs and advance your own interests? Or are you on the low end of the assertiveness scale where you minimize your own needs and fall back away from putting your own interests and positions out there? So somewhere in that continuum, get an idea of how strongly you put your own rights and your own positions out there for others to react to. And you're thinking about this kind of a continuum. We'll call the highly assertive, that might even come out as aggressive. We'll call the low assertiveness, it might even come out as passive. And you can judge where you are based on your own experience thinking about conflict situations that you've entered into or that you've seen brewing around you. It's actually our emotions that often dictate how passively or how aggressively that we respond to given situations. Our emotions that cause us to hold back or to enter in. Now, since it's about our emotions, we probably ought to cover that. There are some ways that you can seize control of your own emotions in dealing with conflict. Controlling your own emotions, being aware of them, and deciding on purpose to manage them, that helps you to be more assertive, not all the way over to aggressive, but more assertive rather than retreating into a passive position. Keeping control of your emotions also helps to prevent you from becoming too aggressive. So just a couple of tips here. Because we want to be effective more than we want to be emotional, I'm not saying that your emotions go away. That would be silly. Your emotions are real. I'm just saying that you want to be in charge of them and not let them be in charge of you. So to do that, you can disengage a little bit from your emotions by taking a deep breath and reminding yourself that you are in control of the situation and how you handle it. You can't control what other people do, but you can certainly control how you respond. So start out, take that deep breath, and then identify and eliminate whatever it is that's making you the most uncomfortable. You could literally, in your head, you could complete this statement. I am most uncomfortable in conflict situations when blank. For me, I'd be saying, I am most uncomfortable in conflict situations when I know at the heart of it that I've let someone down. That's what makes me the most uncomfortable. I need to acknowledge that to myself. That then gives me an opportunity to understand and control my emotional responses. And when you have a starting point, you'll be able to deal with it, and then everything else becomes more clear. It's easier to handle. You can also disengage from your emotions so that you can remain neutral. Right? Two ways to be neutral. First, be sure that you understand the situation before reacting to it. You might do that by asking questions, by assuming good intent, by gathering information before you respond. And then second, look at and talk about observed behaviors instead of attitudes or perceptions. Right? Saying something like, you don't care, that's a judgment about an attitude. Or if you say, you're consistently late to our meetings, that's a behavior. That's an observable, neutral behavior. We want to start there as opposed to assuming that because someone's consistently late to meetings, that they just don't care. We don't want to make those kinds of leaps that take us away from being objective. Okay, now when you have that neutral perspective and you're able to set your emotions aside just enough so that you can be effective, then you can identify your own interests and the interests of the other parties who are involved. And that's how you'll be able to be more objective and to get a hierarchy of needs established, to find out what's most important to you, what's most important to them. And as you're discussing that, you can focus on I statements. That'll help to keep other people from becoming more defensive. In other words, instead of saying things like, you're not making any sense, or you missed the meeting, or you're too slow, instead you'd say things like, I'm not understanding, or I thought our meeting was today at 3 o'clock, or I think we could be doing things faster. When you start with I, you're taking responsibility instead of causing others to feel like they've been attacked when they haven't even had a chance yet to fully understand themselves. Okay, so those are just a few tools, a few ideas for feeling more assertive. I'll actually cover more about that topic in a presentation coming up in a few months about your own leadership effectiveness and your leadership presence. So watch for that one to come. Okay, now that was conflict factor number one, your level of assertiveness. The second factor that comes into play within a conflict and how you respond to it is your cooperativeness. So in addition to your own assertiveness, putting your needs out there and making sure that they are represented and handled through the conflict, in addition to that is your level of cooperativeness, which is about the other party. How willing are you to make sure that their interests are understood and that their interests are met? Again, we can look at this in terms of a continuum. If you are a lone wolf, your level of cooperativeness is low. You are not as interested in other people's needs and interests in that situation. If you're a team player, on the opposite end of the continuum, you do have a high degree of interest in others' needs and in what's going on with them. And obviously, we put judgments on all of this. We would say things like, well, I should be highly assertive and I should be highly cooperative. Those things just sound better. But actually, this is situational. There are times when it's better to be high end on each spectrum and low end on each spectrum. So now I'm going to put these two pieces together and show you 5 different styles for handling conflict. And one of these probably comes most naturally to you. This is from the TKI, that's the Thomas Kilmann instrument. It's a conflict mode that you can get an assessment and can diagnose yourself and your team members. And if you want to work with me on that, we do a lot of workshops with this, and I'd be happy to help you and your team come to understand their own conflict styles better. I have given you a link to learn more about the TKI and the research behind it, but I'm just going to walk you through some of the basics here. You see here 5 different styles of conflict, and they're all using the 2 dimensions we just talked about, assertiveness and cooperativeness. So when you are highly cooperative with others, you're over here on the right side, high cooperativeness. When you have low cooperativeness, it's these 2 boxes on the left that are labeled low cooperativeness. And then, of course, here in the middle, we have medium cooperativeness. And if you have assertiveness, well, it's going to be medium if your cooperativeness is medium. So those 2 things go together in the middle, and we call that compromising. If you have high assertiveness, those are the 2 boxes on the top. Low assertiveness, it's the 2 boxes on the bottom. And we come up with 5 different styles or tendencies when it comes to how you typically respond to conflict. So if we put them together, if we have low assertiveness and low cooperativeness, that's the lower left-hand corner. That's the conflict style or mode known as avoiding. And some just do this naturally. That doesn't mean you can't do the other things. It doesn't mean that you sometimes haven't done the other things. It means that though your first natural inclination is to avoid. That means not to raise an issue that could cause conflict, or that you're making efforts to duck and dodge and simply avoid conflicts because they are uncomfortable to you or because you don't see them as having any benefit. The next box, let's stay on the bottom here and come over to the right-hand side. That's still a low degree of assertiveness, but this time it has a high degree of cooperativeness with it. And that's accommodating. And if your natural style is to be accommodating, then you are probably more often giving in. You're making concessions to gain favor with the other party. And remember, there are no judgments on these. There are no good, bad, better, best. I'm going to show you in subsequent slides the times when every single one of these has some merit. And hopefully you'll be able to see opportunities to be flexible and to choose different styles than the one that comes most naturally. Okay, let's hop up to the upper left-hand corner here. This is where you have a high degree of assertiveness, but a low degree of cooperativeness. And this, according to the folks who put together the TKI, this is called competing. If you are competing, it is an I win and you lose kind of stakes. You might even be viewing conflict as a game. People who enjoy conflict tend to fall in this box more often. This too sounds like I'm making judgments, but I'm not. This too has an appropriate time and place when you know how to use it. In the middle, we have compromising. That's that give and take approach. Both parties get to have a little win. Both parties are going to also give something up. That's compromising. Upper right-hand corner, that's collaborating. These are high assertiveness, high cooperativeness. These end up resulting in pretty creative solutions typically that explore and meet all the needs of both parties. So I'd like to pause here just for a moment and give you a chance to land on whichever one of these styles you think is your typical response, or at least the one that comes most naturally to you, even if you've learned and employ some of the other styles. And I do want to, thanks for the question, I do want to talk a little bit more about compromise versus compromise versus collaborating, because sometimes that gets misunderstood. Here's the difference. When you are compromising, everybody gives up something and everybody gets something that they want. It's the giving up part of a compromise that makes it less satisfying than collaborating, where nobody gives up everything and everybody gets everything that they want. So that's why I say these tend to be pretty creative and complex solutions. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the difference is that in compromising, people give something up, and in collaboration, everybody gets something and doesn't give up anything. But even though it sounds good, collaboration isn't always the best choice. Every one of these has pros and cons. Avoiding. Here are some advantages and disadvantages. When you are avoiding, you might be doing that because somebody came on as highly competitive and you know that they're just going to continue to remain entrenched in their position and there's no real point in continuing the dialogue. So you just avoid, you check out. That might be a valid solution depending on the situation. Or maybe you know that you need to buy a little bit of time and now is not the right time to engage in that conflict. It's not going to be productive, it's not a priority, whatever the reason might be. Or maybe you're avoiding so that others have an opportunity to do the research or to chime in or to take their own position, make up their own mind. You avoid the conflict long enough to bring others into a more complete understanding. Those could all be advantages. Some disadvantages, well, obviously if it's an important matter, avoiding is only a temporary solution. And in many cases, the more you're doing the avoiding, the more the problem is festering, the more upset others are becoming. Maybe the more entrenched they're getting in their position because they feel that you're being disrespectful, or they might make those judgment decisions like you don't care enough to talk it out. So just know that if you're avoiding, you're also holding back your own input. You're not becoming a part of the dialogue or the solution. So situationally, you'll determine when to avoid and when not to avoid. The same is true with accommodating. A lot of people fall into this style, and they do it because they really want to preserve group harmony. They don't want to have the disruptions. They don't want to be disliked in some cases. However, if you find yourself accommodating in every situation and never being accommodated, you're giving and you're giving and you're giving, well, that is going to frustrate you at some point. You're probably allowing a lot to build up in that pressure cooker, and someday when you demand that your needs get met, people are going to be completely surprised by your about face. They're going to be confused by it, and I hope you're not banking on them accommodating you just because you've accommodated them, because frankly, you may have conditioned them to do just the opposite, to only wait to be accommodated. So just be careful, because you could be sacrificing your point of view. Now, on the other hand, there might be times when this is a perfectly good choice to make. Maybe you don't really care too much about what's at stake. It just doesn't matter as much to you as it does to others. So sure, we can accommodate that. Or maybe you've got some ground that you need to make up, some money that you do need to put in the bank. And so you accommodate, but you do it conditionally. Be sure to do it conditionally if that's how you mean it. To tell people, you know, this is something that I can do for you this time. And I can do it because, but I won't always be able to do it. We won't always have the same situation. Let them know that it's not your usual and they shouldn't assume it's your always response. Okay, the third type of that we talked about of conflict is competing. And just like the others, there are advantages and disadvantages. We often view people who take this approach, this sort of all or none approach, we sometimes view them as being very strong. And that's probably what they're looking for us to think. And yeah, maybe they are strong in that moment. But the people who do this all the time, no matter how big or small the issue, we end up ultimately not viewing them as very strong. We sort of start to think of them as being jerks who never yield anything and who are selfish and only about themselves, unwilling to listen to or consider others. So if you find yourself going to this tendency more naturally and more often, just be really careful because it could create some mistrust on the part of others. Now, all of us, though, we should do competing. We should remain absolute in our position when it's something that matters greatly. It's non-negotiable. It's a core value. It's something where people could be hurt by it, where you would have to give up too much for it to happen. There are times and places when we all have to adopt this method of entering into a conflict. But if that's the case, and if it's not your usual, maybe you just flash people some signals here about why. I'm not going to be able to compromise on this one. I'm not going to be able to accommodate this time because, and let them know what it is. Now, here are the two that are usually viewed a little more favorably. We hear a lot in the workplace about how important it is to compromise. But I'd like you to remember that compromising is inherently a suboptimum solution. Right? No parties are fully satisfied. There's always a little something left by the wayside on the cutting room floor. I did not get everything that I wanted when I compromised. So although we may be satisfied short term, the compromise could begin to feel a little bit like a diluted or a watered down kind of a solution. I recommend thinking about compromise as an interim solution. So here's how we can move forward. You do this and give up that. I'll do this and give up that. And let's come back to this in 3 months or next week or at some point in the future and see if we can make a little more progress. Compromise does move things forward. You just want to be really careful in your compromising that it doesn't become accommodating so that you're the one doing all of the giving. A compromise is meant to be a little of each from both parties so it feels equitable. One of the disadvantages of compromising, in addition to it being the risk of win-lose and the fact that no one goes away completely satisfied, is that the conflict can resurface. So compromise typically is a Band-Aid, and that's why I say you ought to view it as a temporary solution. Here's the one that sounds the best, and I think in an ideal situation, we would always be able to fully collaborate. That's where all my needs get met and all of your needs get met. For that to happen, it requires a great deal of trust. I have to be able to tell you everything that I need and why. You have to be comfortable enough to be vulnerable and to tell me everything that you need and why. And then we have to be equally committed. I need to be committed to getting your needs met. You need to be committed to getting my needs met. And that's going to require some time. This is the most time-consuming out of all 5 options. If we can commit to this and maybe have an interim compromise along the way, collaborating in this manner is really powerful. But there might be some conflict along the way. we might not come to a ready agreement during this collaboration. There might be some ups and downs, sometimes when we need to escalate and de-escalate that conflict situation. But we can do it if we're equally committed and if we're entering into it with good intent, and if we keep our goals focused on the outcomes that benefit both of us and where we have mutual goals in place. Now, as I said before, communication is at the core of everything that we're talking about here. And for those who came in a little late, just notice that in the attachments and links, I also included a link to a previous webinar from last month about communication skills, so that it's a companion piece to this one. But when conflict arises, even if it's a conflict that's sort of under the radar and we're just trying to avoid it, we're trying to preserve the harmony, we're in that status right now where we're letting the harmony and the opportunities for us to be treading water, we're just kind of staying in place rather than escalating the conflict. We are staying in that situation where we've got that durable harmony or that stable harmony in the workplace. So we're accepting the groupthink. We're accepting that we don't have every option on the table. We're accepting that not every voice is in the mix. And we're just kind of going along to get along. When that's happening, be careful. And as your team gets stronger and stronger, you'll be able to more often surface the opinions of everyone without it devolving into a big, messy conflict. Instead, it can be a productive conflict where people are expressing their opinions and they're challenging each other's assertions and they're showing mutual admiration and respect so that they get the full picture out there. That's the aim. And it is possible. I've worked with a lot of teams who have moved from a place of barely speaking to each other to having good, regular dialogue that brings all voices in and that helps them to create better solutions and to be more effective and more proud of the work that they're doing. Last but not least, I'd love to talk with you more about this. I've given you my email address in the announcement that I put out there. That's my website. There's a blog. You can join our community. There's also, if you would like to have training for your team, there are team workshops, not just team effectiveness, but also manager training. Or if you're looking for something you can do on your own, there's also a self-paced e-learning version of our Workplace Conversations program. I invite you to take a look at all of that and just let me know if you have questions. We've got just a couple minutes here. I can take any additional questions that I haven't answered yet. If you've got some that you'd like to post, I'll be looking for those as I just remind everybody that this is part 2 of a 12-part series. Every one of the presentations stands alone, but if you come in for all 12 parts, you're going to be getting lots of insights into how to be more effective in both managing work and leading people. My company is People First Productivity Solutions. The work that we do is all about building organizational strength by putting people first. And we use a variety of tools like the TKI that I mentioned, the MBTI, the Echo Listening Assessment, and some of our own tools that are, we bring those out when the needs of the team are indicating that they're needed. We always survey team members before we come in with any solution because we want them to have a voice in shaping what we do together. So give me a call. I'm Deb Calvert. Send me an email if there's anything that we could be doing together to help your organization to become stronger by putting people first. Thanks very much for attending, and if you don't mind, just leave me a little review. Hope you're here with me next month.